Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third webinar in our Asset Management Awareness Month series. My name is Kim Sager, and I'm the VP of Communications and Marketing. Before we get started and I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to run through some logistics. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our MPMA website and YouTube channel later this month. If you're logged in today and listening, you will automatically receive CEU credit. And then lastly, if you have questions during the presentation, please write them in the question box and we'll address them as we can. Now I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Douglas Getz and Mr. Tom Ruckdaschel. Dr. Getz was an industrial property management specialist, property administrator, professor at the Air Force Institute of Technology, professor at the Defense Acquisition University, and his last job, president of GP Consultants, LLC. He is a prolific writer, dynamic speaker, award-winning professor, and even a talented game show host. After 40 years of experience in defense contract property management and having traveled all over the world, Dr. Getz is now sort of retired, but still doing presentations and writing as a true expert in the property and asset management profession. Mr. Tom Ruckdaschel is an independent consultant specializing in federal government contract property requirements and related DoD business systems. Tom has over 35 years experience in property management and has worked for the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Defense Contract Management Agency. Tom was also a major contributor to the FAR government property rewrite effort and related DoD FAR supplements. Tom has a Bachelor of Science in Management and 2 master's degrees. Doug, you better watch out. He's smart.
Yeah, I tell Doug anybody
Tom,
can get one.
Take it away.
Hey, Tom, they make it sound like we know what we're doing, huh? So.
Yes, and by the way, Doug is also good with aerial reconnaissance, I've just recently found out, but we'll talk about that later.
Very good.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, excellent. So there's the title slide. Yep, it's still there. Right-sizing expectations for meeting contractor self-assessment requirements under FAR 52.245-1. To start this off, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Tom Ruckdaschel, and he has a wonderful, wonderful introductory story. Tom?
Thank you, Dr. Doug. This is one of those issues that it's funny how these things come about. I hear a story, I tell Doug about it, leads to lots of discussions and phone calls, which leads to an article, which leads to a presentation, and then here we are, just because somebody told me a story. So the story is, and this is a good source, so I'm going to say it's a good story. There was a contractor, a small contractor, with literally just one piece of property. It wasn't sensitive of any kind. It wasn't a firearm or a nuclear weapon or anything. It's just one piece of property. And the government came in to do the PMSA. Why the government was there for one piece, I don't know, but that's another story. And the government asked the contractor and said, will you please describe for me your process of self-assessments and internal reviews. And with that, the contractor person turned his head, went to one side, turned to the right, and looked at the property and said, "Yep, it's still there." Now, to me, that was a really that was just one of those little magical moments in my head where it's pretty clear that that was perfectly fine for that particular contractor. And that compliance is not a one-size-fits-all proposition when it comes to just about anything, but when it comes to the FAR-1 clause especially. And it's much depends on the size of the contractor. And I like to say there are large contractors and small contractors and really small contractors. And then my own additional one, we're just happy to make payroll small contractors. There's literally contractors with just a handful of people. And this particular contractor was one of those. And, you know, the prevailing wisdom is to try to impose lots and lots of requirements on these small contractors, and it doesn't always work very well. It doesn't always work out. But much also depends on the scope of the program the contractor may be working on, the complexity, whether or not it's the risk, whether or not there's sensitive property involved. But it really suggests a tailored approach to oversight. Right now, I don't think the government has a tailored approach. I think we just try to make everyone, we treat everybody the same. Doesn't always work that well. But if you require a tailored approach, then that means some judgment should guide the way. So next slide, Doug. So back in the day, Doug will remember this because he goes back as far as I do, a little bit farther. There were self-assessment programs for property, but they kind of evolved organically. They just sort of sprouted up. There wasn't a FAR mandate of any kind. DCMA had a program called Contractor Self-Oversight, and there were MOUs in place with some of the larger firms, and they would do periodic PMSAs on their own. The Air Force contract management folks had their own program called SIMSEP, Contractor Management System Self-Evaluation Program. And then in June 2007, largely because of all of these other programs that already existed, self-assessment programs that already existed, we said, hey, let's make that a FAR requirement. Everyone thought that was a great idea. Even industry said, yeah, we're doing that anyway. Let's put that in the FAR. And subsequent to that, things evolved even further. In the ASTM 2013, ASTM 2936 came out with the standard guide for contractor self-assessment. That's an old historical reference because it's changed. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the current iteration. But it just that's kind of how these things evolved over time. Next slide. So this is what the FAR says. Always good to put the basic requirement up on the screen so everybody has a quick refresher. The contractor will have a system of internal controls. The system should be adequate to satisfy the requirements of the clause. The contractor shall have processes, systems, procedures, etc. And then there's a little bit extra. The contractor will establish and maintain necessary to assess property management system and perform periodic internal reviews, surveillances, self-assessments, or audits. Now, before I go to the next slide, which I think is Doug's, you'll see there's a range there. There's a range between internal reviews and audits and everything in between. The FAR doesn't say the contractor will have an internal audit program or an internal this or how to do it. FAR is very broadly written because it's the FAR. So you'll see, we'll talk about this as we go forward in the presentation, a range of different types of internal reviews that contractors can employ. And by extension, that means the government has to adjust to how the contractor intends to do those reviews. Now, one of those reviews was that gentleman I just mentioned earlier. He turned to the property and said, yeah, it's still there. Walking around is an internal review, and that's what he did. Over to you, Doug. I think that's the next slide. I have one more. I have one more. So dash one, I like to remind everybody, it's written like a performance-based contract. It's mostly written in performance-based terms with a few extra things in it for clarification. It describes what needs to be done. It doesn't say how to do it, doesn't say when to do it for the most part. It applies universally for contracts with government property, but I would argue it doesn't apply equally. Some adjustments have to be made between types of contracts, contract terms, small and large contractors, the management approach of the contractor. Contract types, a system with fixed price only is way different than a cost reimbursement contract, as you all know, I think. Property type, is it furniture or is it firearms? Some contractors have property located at subcontractors. Some do not, but subcontract management can differ amongst all of those amongst contractors and differing contract terms, of course. So I want to go back to that one paragraph I just mentioned in the previous slide. The contract, this is in the dash one, contractors will establish, number one, establish and maintain procedures necessary, and then it talks about 3, perform periodic internal reviews and assessments. Now, what I did there is I put those numbers in front of each piece, 1, 2, and 3, establish, maintain, and perform, because it is very much a sequence of events. We'll talk about this as we go further in the slides. But the point on this particular slide is there are 3 things that have to happen. You establish procedures, you keep them up to date, i.e. maintain. and then you do the periodic internal reviews or audits or assessments. Notice the periodically performed internal reviews is not number 1, it's number 3. It comes at the end of the procedural um, preparation and publication. Okay, now I think we go to Doug.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
Yeah.
One of the things that I always like to address is this issue of certainty of terms, understanding what these words that we use, these phrases that we use, how are they operationalized? How are they defined? Can we see any visual representation here? So we need an understanding of these terms by all of the participants, both government side of the house, industry side of the house. And there are 4 terms that we really wanted to focus on within this construct here: internal reviews, surveillances, self-assessments, and audits. So the idea being that these are varying degrees, these are varying levels of different types of look-sees, of looking at something, right? If we're looking at an internal review, it's a formal assessment or examination of something with the possibility or intention of instituting change if necessary. Well, if we do a review and things are going along fine, it doesn't need to be fixed. It is operating smoothly, processing properly within the parameters that we've established there. Fine, an internal review. We could talk about surveillances, and it's a generic term. Notice the note first. We're not talking about video surveillance and watching for thievery and for break-ins and stuff like that. No. In this context, we're looking at activities. We're looking at information, data, for the purpose of information gathering, influencing, managing, or directing. And I like the word managing there because that's what we expect contractors to have, is a property management system. Some of you might have remembered that before 2007 iteration of the FAR, the word there was the property control system. That word control has different meanings than manage or managing or management. So here we see that surveillance is slightly different than what we just saw as an internal review. Going a little bit further, self-assessments. Now, Tom has already mentioned the one standard that was out there. The most current standard was just revised last year with some changes. We encourage you to look at those standards to see that the protocols that were put in place for that, the guidance placed in that document, might be applicable. You might have applicability of that within your structure. But it says contractor self-assessment as an auditing, assessment, review, or surveillance program implemented by a contractor. Implemented by a contractor. And that's important to note, that the requirement is in the clause, but the application of that, the implementation of that, is by the contractor to identify, evaluate, take corrective action on compliance and operational risks resulting from business practices for government property management. Business practices that may not be effective, may not be have that efficacy. That word is very popular right now, as to accomplishing that set of goals that are out there, those requirements that are there. So we'd encourage you to look at these different constructs. And we have been given some guidance. And Tom, I'm going to turn it back over to you for this slide.
Yep, that is actually from the DCMA manual 2301. And I include it here in the presentation because it does indicate that DCMA supports the idea this is of a contractor self-assessment, and that they will use those self-assessments. So it says, a good self-assessment, i.e. one that identifies deficiencies, root causes, implements corrective actions, benefits both contractor and the government. And leveraging that self-assessment rate may reduce audit time and offer some dollar savings and reductions in losses to programs. So that's just an alert that not everybody is like me and Doug and go online and read all these manuals and so forth, but I do. And I think that's an important piece of information to pass on. DCMA, who is largely responsible for much of the PMSAs today, does support the concept of a contractor self-assessment.
Excellent.
And you can find that manual online very easily.
Very good. Thank you, Tom.
Sure.
One of the other terms that we didn't deal with is this construct of an audit. All right. We have a few friends, Tom and I, that are strict constructionists. That, in their opinion, there is only one audit agency within Department of Defense, and that is DCAA. Why they take the traditionalist approach as to what an auditor is. But if we really want to look at this, there's a very broad interpretation of the word audit. It's a term used by numerous other activities to address that. And we've seen this in quality assurance. We've seen this in ISO. There are a goodly number of fields out there that treat their reviews and use the term audit. So yes, the term audit can be used. Mind you, you might get some pushback by various other activities like AICPA, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, IIA, which is the Institute of Internal Auditors. They want to protect their turf by using the term audit in a very restrictive fashion, but we need to be a little bit broader in that. So when we're dealing with self-assessments, we're looking at an internal audit. And I didn't go to the IIA site, the Internal Institute of Internal Auditors, but rather looking at some of the other references on the web that are out there. Internal audits evaluate a company's internal controls, governance. Now, we're not so much an accounting activity as we are looking at these management, these compliance audits. And even if we were to go to the Yellow Book, GAGAS, Government General Accepted Government Auditing Standards, they talk about compliance audits. And that's really in property what we're doing. And an internal audit is, in fact, a compliance audit. Compliance with regulations. Regulations. And that's what we're doing here under FAR 52245-1. Help to maintain accurate and timely financial reporting. Well, we could maybe extrapolate that to having these property records such that there could be financial data collected. For example, if you're under DOD, you all know about FIRE, the Financial Improvement Audit Readiness, Financial Improvement Audit Remediation. But look at the part that we put in red. Internal audits also provide management tools necessary to attain operational efficiency by identifying problems and correcting lapses before they are discovered, say, in an internal audit. There's nothing wrong with contractors doing internal audits and fixing their system. And somebody said to me at one point, but Doug, if they do all these things and they fix that system, well, if we tell them we're coming in, they'll fix the system. And my response at that point, from a humorous standpoint, was, and you have a problem with them fixing their system? Isn't that ultimately what we want? Them to take their own initiative to do that? So need to go on. So the FAR Government Property Clause allows discretion, allows the contractor the discretion to choose the methodology that they're going to use that is most effective, most efficient, most efficacious in its application. So essentially, there's differing levels of degrees of assessment. So I want to show you, we talked about this, and then we drew up a little chart here to show you a hierarchy, right? And to remind you, it's the contractor that establishes, performs that assessment process to meet its needs and of course to comply with the clausal requirements. So this is the way we pointed it out, an inverse pyramid here. If we're looking at items from the standpoint of a review, the bottom part of that, it's the least complex application. A review could be considered just a small review, and Tom talked about the contractor turning around and looking and identifying and seeing that that one piece of government property was there. The next step up would be more formal surveillances. surveillances, right? Need not have the ease of a review, but does not meet the standard of an audit. And the audit is the most complex out there if you're going to follow standard audit protocols. And tons of books are out there on performing audits using GAS, generally accepted auditing standards. Or you can even look at the Yellow Book, generally accepted government auditing standards, which was named after the contemporary singer by the name of Lady Gaga. So she's sorry, it's the bad joke, all right? Generally accepted government auditing standards, Yellow Book. Now, why? This is a technical issue. Why was it called the Yellow Book? Because it had a yellow cover in deference to the Green Book or other books that are out there within the government. So, very good. So, when we talk about procedures, procedures could be quite simple, depending upon the complexity of that property management system. Procedures could also be extremely complex, depending upon the complexity of that property management system. So it's important that you think about these systems that are in place and how we're going to handle that. Tom, I think you have a few words as to the process that could be applied here.
Yeah. So one of the things I've come to realize in my brief tenure as a consultant and had some time to reflect on some of this stuff, that the procedure development that contractors go through, especially new contractors or ones that maybe have neglected this stuff for a while, they go through a process of procedure development, and that is a form of self-assessment. And I'll give one quick story. I had a contractor who took 6 to 8 months to do their procedure. And like anything else, it takes time to do all the coordinations, to get it right, and so forth. And it was finally published and stamped by the boss, and it went out. And the next day, the contractor said, "And now we're going to do our self-assessment." And I said, "What do you think you just did?" So procedure development is a form of self-assessment. It creates a baseline on that particular time, a gauge of whether things are properly documented and working as intended. Are they working? I should have said if it's working. Anyway, revise the procedure and establish a new baseline. Every time you do a procedural update, you create a new baseline and you go forward from that. The first line of defense is a mature and stable procedure. It's got to be in place for your self-assessment to occur. For the most part, there are some things that maybe you could do without a procedure, but for the sake of this discussion, you really need your procedure in place, because that's what the FAR says up in the previous slides. You do a procedure first, remember the sequence, you maintain it, and then you do the self-assessment. Just FYI, when you start from scratch, expect at least one revision within the first 6 months of publication. That's Tom's doctrine here, I guess, because when things get published, and I've seen this at DoD when we were working, things get published and everybody comes out of the woodwork and says, "Oh my gosh, where did this come from?" As much as coordination as you do, you always miss someone. So the first iteration is not always the most complete. Version number 2 is where the stuff really gets finalized. That's just an observation, not particularly scientific, but in my experience, number 2 is the good one. So back to trying to assess, do a self-assessment after your procedure has been published doesn't always make sense. If it's been in force and effect for only a few days or even a few months, depending on complexity and many other factors, you may not be able to do a self-assessment in a very meaningful way. It's a new baseline. You need time for the organization to accept it and absorb it and understand it. You may have to do some outreach. You may have to do some training and so forth. You got to let the food cook, as I like to say. It's not soup yet. Let it get out there a few weeks, and don't worry about having to do something the very next day. In my experience, folks who want to do something the very next day are doing it to keep DCMA happy and not to keep the organization moving toward continuous improvement. Observation, not scientific. For one thing, after you have your procedure published, you may not have it, if you're doing statistical samples, you may not have a sufficient number of samples. Let's say you publish your procedure on March 1st, and are you going to look at receiving the next day? Well, you may not have anything to receive. You may have 2 receiving reports. You might want to wait 6 months to have a suitable amount of samples to make it a meaningful review. So as Doug can talk about population specification errors here, but if you have that kind of situation, you want to wait a little bit of time for the procedure to mature. If you don't do that, you could render your whole internal audit results invalid, and then you've just wasted your time. So those are just observations based on at least our experience.
And Tom, I really like the last bullet about letting this mature and having then sufficient number of samples. If you were to pull samples just right after you implemented a new procedural change, you're probably going to get actions that were taken prior to that change.
Yes.
And
yes.
those are no longer what you're reviewing for current operations. So that statistical anomaly or error of having population specification error.
In other words, you could be finding deficiencies and so forth for things that occurred because you didn't have a procedure, and now you have one. So your corrective action is to create a procedure, but you already did that. You can see the loop you get in here if you don't manage this well. So that's why I always suggest take some time, do some reflection on that procedure, see what works and what doesn't, but give it time to cook.
Excellent. Excellent. Right. So with that, I wanted us to notice that we're not alone in this, right? Now, this is coming out of the American Society of Quality, what used to be the American Society of Quality Control, and it's referred to as the Shewhart cycle. If you are not familiar with this, please Google it. Please do some research, because it lays out what we're trying to present here also. Your procedures are the starting point where you plan something, you write those procedures. You're then going to actually perform. You're going to do what it says to do in the procedures. And that's something that's really interesting, that in various other forums, you can write the most grand and glorious procedures imaginable, but if you don't follow them, you don't have procedures. So it's really important to understand that there's 2 aspects. Tom has addressed the issue of writing the procedures, absolutely critical. The next step that we're looking at is you have to do what the procedure said you were going to do. So plan, perform, or plan, do, then you're doing your audit during the checking or monitoring phase. You're looking, are things going the way we said we wanted them to go? And if not, back to what Tom said, this continuous improvement, looking at these procedures to ensure that they were properly written, properly implemented, and they're being consistently performed, right? Tom has also said this is not a one and done action. In other words, this will be continuous there. Shifting gears a tiny bit, it's involved also with determining when should I be doing self-assessment. So we need to ask, are there risks involved with our property management system? Are there risks involved with the property itself? Keeping in mind that risks are potential future events. Future events. Sometimes we confuse that things that have occurred, which are considered occurrences, really are not looking at risk. You need to fix those because they've already occurred. So risks are potential future events or conditions that might have a negative effect on achieving program objectives. Cost, schedule, or performance in regard to establishing and maintaining that property management system. How are they defined then? An undesired event and or condition. The probability of an undesired event or condition occurring. Realistic probability here. Sometimes we've seen events that may not be a realistic event, and even if they were brought out as a risk, what can we expect the contractor to do about them? and then the consequences or impact of that undesired event should it occur. So when we're performing that self-assessment, we have numerous factors. Tom gave the litany of those factors, talking about large contractors, small contractors, really small contractors, and even some contractors say, I just want to be able to pay my people next week. We need to look at the scope of the contractual requirements, the complexity of those contractual requirements. So not only do we need to be concerned with those variables, but we also have to consider this issue of risk, all right? This issue of risks that are there. Tom, if you'd like to go through these as some reiterative process.
Yep. So the formal self-assessment, which is the top of that pyramid, as Doug mentioned, they work really well when you have a stable, mature program self-assessment procedure. They don't work very well when your procedures are still in development or when things are in a state of flux. So I always suggest finish your procedure, which is a self-assessment of a kind, and then you can start putting together a formal self-assessment program. I think it's two different things, two different processes. How will you know that procedure is stable and mature? One of the things I look for is other standards, and there is a standard, ASTM standard, E2452-12 on maturity models, and it's an equipment maturity model, but it's very much on point. When you get to the maturity level 2, it talks about processes that are described and consistently performed at the operational level with consistent results. So when you feel your processes meet that that requirement, that description, then you're pretty comfortable that you've reached that stage where things are stable. Typically, this occurs when people stop screaming. That's true. It's absolutely true. That's why the version 1 will always be followed by a version 2. No matter how hard you try, when you have a big organization, when things get published, people come out and say, well, how did this happen? I wasn't told. But generally speaking, version 2 works, is the one to focus on. So stability has to be in place for a period of time without dramatic change. There's a hidden word in there. I would put take time, words in there. I would say take time to reflect on what you've accomplished, on what you've done, and give it some time. Voluntary consensus standards. Of course, the FAR clause does allow use of voluntary consensus standards as applicable to a contractor system. FYI, the VCS language was in the FAR long before we started doing the property rule. It was in other sections of the FAR. Some folks think that was a new thing in 2007. It was not. We just repurposed it to the property business system. We reference it, I forgot what that second bullet meant. We referenced an ACSTM VCS.
Yeah, because we talked about the dash 13.
Oh, yes, in the prior slide. Okay. You'll see 2936 is the standard guide for contractor self-assessments for U.S. government asset management systems. It's a really great guide. Would I encourage that gentleman on the first slide who turned around and said, yep, it's still there at one piece of property, to use that guide? I wouldn't. I would say that's too much. You're not there yet. Once you've grown to a point where your system is more complex, you've gone from small to large contractor, you've got a lot of more property, you've got cost out, you've grown, you've matured, then you can start looking at that standard guide. That's why it's called a guide. It's not a mandatory thing. Now I'm going to have some fun. DoD business systems is sort of my favorite topic, one of my favorite topics. Started back in 2011. It was an interim rule. Interim rules mean that they're mandatory upon publication. Contracting offices, DoD now, contracting officers are required to determine acceptability of a contractor's business system, approve, disapprove, pursue corrective actions, pursue correction of deficiencies. And there were 6 business systems affected. Property management was one of them, is one of them. And we also have another clause, 7005, for CAS covered contracts, which is the authority for a withhold. I won't talk about that here. But just be aware that we still have a business system in place. The DFAR, which accompanies this, next slide. You can see this spelled out in 245-105. That's where the DFAR requirement was published. Couples with the -1 requirement to have a system of internal controls adequate to satisfy the requirements of the clause. So those are two important regulatory pieces of regulatory language I would encourage everybody to be familiar with. But now the fun starts. Next slide. Did you know? Everybody's going to fall off their chair. The National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2021 amended the DoD business system requirements. And in that piece of legislation, they removed the phrase significant deficiency and has been replaced with material weakness. This comes from a DoD 809 panel report, which you can find online very easily if you Google it. They recommended that material weakness be used to be more consistent with the definitions and generally accepted auditing standards that apply to different types of engagements. So they took the significant deficiency out, they've added material weakness in, and that creates a whole nother bit of complexity that DoD has to figure out. Now, although the statute was passed, the DoD has not changed the DFAR yet. There is a DFAR case, I know, it's been opened. It could take a long time for them to publish. So this does not mean stop what you're doing and change everything. You have to wait for the DFAR rule to come out because even the government doesn't know what to do with this yet. They have to do a lot of sorting out and alignment of priorities and alignment of other things. But the impact will be contractor procedures, government personnel, who performs the oversight, and what standards are used. Doug mentioned earlier about what is an auditor and who is an auditor, excuse me, and who is not an auditor. This new legislation ties directly to that question. An argument could be made that because material weakness is only is part of generally accepted auditing standards, that only, quote, auditors can do it. Does that mean that only DCAA can do a property review or a purchasing review or an MMAS review? I don't know. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But much depends on how the FAR will be changed, and this could take a while. So my advice at this point is to be alert to this upcoming change. And complicated business. We'll see what happens. But right now, we don't change a thing. Got to wait for the DFAR to be revised. Tying it all together, business system processes tend to be closely and uniquely related. Property and purchasing, two sides of the same coin, in my opinion. Their process borders are not always distinct. The category, the element of acquisition in property mirrors that of purchasing system reviews, in my purchasing system requirements, in my view. The subcontract control and flow down requirements in property mirrors very similar to the requirements of the purchasing system criteria. Be alert to those two business systems. We often see acquisition processes, which is a purchasing function, cited in property procedures. That's okay, but in my experience, when larger companies may not always talk to each other, and the people in purchasing may not be aware of the language in the property procedure, and vice versa. So when you do your self-assessment, consider those gaps and overlaps between those two systems, as well as other systems, but those are the big two I can see. And when regarding that new NDAA language, when DoD does put out a proposed rule, which they'll have to do a proposed rule on this new NDA language, take part in the public comment process if you can, and don't sit idly by and wait for others to do it, because the more people that weigh in and the more voices that are heard makes for a better product in the end.
And Tom, we've heard that a lot of times, that, well, why didn't we get a chance to say something about this? Yes, all of you, government and industry, are given the opportunity to comment on this. If you're on industry side, your corporation might have a policy. If you're on the government side, internal to your agency, but you as private citizens have every right to send in a comment. And Tom, don't they have to respond to each and every comment through that public comment process?
They have to address each one. Yeah, that's in some way. Not that you'll get a letter back, but when you have a lot of comments, they'll be summarized. Sometimes they just summarize them. Because, for example, if 5 people send in basically the same comment, well, they're not going to respond 5 different times. They're going to summarize it and do it that way. But generally speaking, yeah, they have to address every comment that comes in.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Don't want you to think you're wasting your time out there.
Yes.
So the next 2 slides deal with some deep thinking. And this is what my expectation, this is what our expectation is that this is not just rote regurgitation of what's been said, but in any type of assessment, self-assessment here, or even external assessment through, say, a PMSA, I would hope and we would encourage that you think deeply about this. So we've painted 2 different scenarios. The first one is a small contractor with multiple fixed price contracts. Fixed price, say they have about 10, 12 of them, right? The only property they have is government furnished property, and it happens to be inspection gauges. There are 26 items. The total dollar value about $92,000. Okay, not bad. Procedures appear to be relatively mature. They were last updated about 4 years ago. And in looking at their system, just from this perspective, we decided that they would be low risk. They're going to do an internal self-assessment on a triennial basis. So here are our processes that are out there. What processes would require review? So this is where we're asking you to think deeply about the processes called out in 52-245-1, paragraph F. There are the 10 of them. We'll talk about the way some of them have been framed through other activities, but do I care what they acquire under fixed price contracts? Is there really a concern about receiving if this property has been there for years and no other GFP has been provided? Certainly, I have to consider records. Certainly, I have to consider, based upon their procedures, their physical inventory process. Are they doing an annual or biennial or triennial? What physical inventory frequency did they put in, and what methodology do they use? Were they doing inventory by exception? Were they doing a wall-to-wall inventory? Were they doing a cyclic? So all of these are issues that come out of paragraph F, and one has to think about, do I need to do a self-assessment on that? If there are no subcontractors, then would you review subcontractor control? No, because there are no subcontractors. If there has been no loss, well, we could do a reverse analysis and lots of other things there, but no reported losses. And in the inventory showed that they had all of those 26 items of special tooling because they were still performing, producing, and delivering items that required inspection with that tooling. Consumption, it's only special tooling. I wouldn't review consumption because there's no material. Storage, movement, internal reviews there, turning around, looking at the desk was, yeah, the tool's right there, or in this case, there are 26 that we might want to look at in the tool room. So the point we're trying to make with this slide and the next one, we want you to think before any type of review, we want you to think which processes and their sub-processes called out under paragraph F have applicability to the environment, and how are they addressed within the property management system procedures. Back again to what Tom said, the foundational element of all of this is, what do their procedures say? How have they structured that? The second part of that is, let's take it to a larger contractor where there are multiple cost reimbursement contracts. Thinking deeply now, there's some GFP, a couple items of special test equipment, but there's lots of material out there, CAP material, government property of the contractor acquired or property origin of the material classification. Procedures were written about a year ago. Maybe, yeah, we're counting them as being fairly stable there. But their property management system, they've tried to implement a new system there, maybe brought in some new software that they've installed. Maybe there's been new management that's come in. Maybe some of those multiple cost reimbursement type contracts, one of them was just awarded in the past year. So notice there are question marks next to the majority of processes. As we think through this, do we need to review those? And what's framing that within your mindset? The first step, again, review the procedures. So we see all of those, and we're not going to give you the answers here. This is where we want you to look at your systems and make a determination as to applicability. Now, notice there's a small comment here, and to what extent are the populations used for each required to be parsed into smaller segments, all right? Processes and outcomes, maybe sub-processes are there. The FAR lists 10. Are 10 sufficient? DCMA, through some current publications, this is they're going to use 22. And if some of you have read the System Analysis Primer, the book, within that, I have 36 sub-processes. So the answer you hear many times in many of our lectures, it depends. Back to the criteria that we mentioned earlier as to what is the complexity, what is the risk involved, right? And determining what self-assessment application you're going to use there. So we have some takeaways for you. Tom, going to let you start with that one.
So the takeaway number one, the procedure must exist, and without it, there's nothing to assess. It's all about the procedure. So that's takeaway number one.
Takeaway number two, it's a sequential requirement. Tom broke it down. Number one, establish. Number two, maintain. Number three, perform the periodic reviews, surveillances, self-assessments, or audits. 4 different potential applications. Not one size fits all. So 4 different applications within that.
Yeah, and on number 3, if you can go back to that just a second.
This one?
The word that comes to mind on number 3 is scalability. It's designed to be scalable from the high-end, robust audit to something less complicated, such as perform an internal review. So anyway, takeaway number 3, your procedure development is a self-assessment in and of itself. They are not 2 different things. So that's takeaway number 3.
Yes, the clause quite clearly by statutory allowance, statutory requirement, yes, you are allowed to use voluntary consensus standards. And in point of fact, if we look at some of the implementing guidance, it says government employees shall participate in the development of voluntary consensus standards. So I hope and pray that many of you listening right now are members of ASTM and have looked at the various proposed standards and guides that they generate. There is a requirement in the FAR Government Property Clause. Tom, takeaway number 5.
Takeaway number 5, be aware of that interconnectedness of business systems that I mentioned earlier. It ain't just property as a standalone. For example, we talked about the 6 different business systems in the previous slide that came under the business system rule in 2011. You have an accounting. How do these things attach to property? Well, you have the property system, number 1. You have an accounting system, which gets into costs that are reasonable, allowable, and allocable, which impacts title to cap. You have MMAS, which is obvious, the material management accounting system, which is connected to property. You have the purchasing system, which I mentioned, with acquisition language and consent to subcontract and subcontract flow down, which is connected to property. And even the estimating system, when a contractor is responding to a new solicitation, should include at least run that by their property people, so any potential reutilization of existing property is addressed. So at least 4 out of those 6 business systems are very much connected to your property system. Unfortunately, in the world, even within DoD, these business systems tend to be stovepiped with different people working different business systems and not being aware necessarily of the other business systems and how they connect. So just be aware of that, and that's takeaway number 5.
And quite clearly, Tom and I have a shameless plug, right,
Shameless
Tom?
promotion.
Absolutely, absolutely. There is the article in the issue of the Property Professional. I believe it's the current issue. Yep, it's still there. Rightsizing expectations. There is the link to the webpage, and surprisingly, NPMA does have its resources as open source. In other words, even non-members can get at that. So. It is labeled questions, and Tom, there were a couple questions there, and I'm having a little bit of a problem here. Here we go, where I can see them.
I can't see them either.
Okay, I can see them, so I'm going to read them out loud, and then either you can jump in or I can.
I got them. Okay.
All right. So this question from one of our attendees: keep the procedures simple. The question is, how specific should you go into detail with timelines in your procedures? I know that there has been a current push where time frames are necessary. Tom, any ideas about that one?
Well, I never, the idea of timelines is good. I never had an issue with timelines. I confess I did have an issue with the government trying to impose a timeline, which is a different thing. My recommendations to contractors is they should have a timeline. I always say it all starts with receiving. They should have a timeline about when items hit the loading dock. How long does it take you to create a receiving report? Number 1. And from there, how long does it take your records to be updated with the information that just came in on that receiving report? How long should that take? Ideally, it's so much that there's so many factors. There's some industry stuff out there that talks about 5 days. 5 days to me is probably reasonable, but there's no regulation that says 5 days is reasonable. So I would just say do your own internal analysis to see what makes sense for you, and work with your contracting officer, your DCMA property administrator, on what those timelines should be, so you don't get hit with a corrective action request. But there's nothing anywhere that says 3 days is good and 5 days is bad. But suffice to say, that's my answer. Not a good answer, but.
So I would like to take a slightly different tack, Tom.
Sure.
We've already said that procedure development takes time.
Yes.
In regard to time frames being implemented within a property management system and its procedures, I would start collecting data, establishing metrics to see, well, how long does it really take us to receive this? I actually do some metrics, do some maybe time motion studies, and answer the question: how long does it take to receive? How long does it take from the issuance of items, of material, to when they are posted on the record? Maintain that metric so that then you have knowledge that you can actually put a time frame into your procedures that you can live with. Regrettably, if you just pick an arbitrary, capricious time frame, that could rear up and hurt you at some point during an audit. So that would be my take on it.
Quick war story. Contractor had consistently received their property within 2 days. Consistently, every sample we looked at, except for one, and it was 5 days. So we started digging into it. Well, the item came in on the afternoon of December 31st. Okay, New Year's Eve, which was a Thursday. Nobody came to work on Friday. Nobody came to work on Saturday. Nobody came to work on. It eventually got received Monday. Is that a problem? No. To me, that's an outlier. That's the kind of thing that happens. So when you say if you're going to put in your procedures 3 days, you also have to accommodate things like that can happen, and they do happen. if things come in on a Friday or before or a holiday, you're not going to meet that timeline. But so a little war story.
Yeah, operationalize what you mean by day. Also, if we look at the definition of day in the
Yes.
FAR 2.101, it defines for us the
Yes.
issue of being a calendar day.
Yes.
And as such, if we're going to do that, you have to put a caveat, a conditional on that and say, hey, look, but there are times where we'll do variance because there are going to be holidays involved there, or you might have a plant shutdown, or any number of variances. And I would hope
Yes.
that anybody doing the self-assessment or even the other audits, external audits, could understand that there's allowance for some degree of deviation, right? Hey, Tom, there was one other comment made, and it's not a question so much as it is a comment from one of our leaders in NPMA, Ms. Yvonne Batcher. She put in that the use of ECSs are allowed under grants and the uniform guidance. The old OMB circulars, A21, A111, now put into the uniform guidance there. So VCSs are allowed to be used in the nonprofit world as well. Thank you, Yvonne, for sharing that with us. Also for other customers who might be out there.
Yes.
So I do not see any other questions. Oh, okay. Wait a minute. There is one more. So to understand, if I already have a procedure in place and I review for updates, have I performed a self-assessment?
Yes. Yes. If you want a yes or no answer, the answer is yes. Now take it to the next step. That doesn't mean after some period of time you want to go back and do a little bit. You want to.
I would use the word validate there, Tom.
Validate, expand upon that, yes. But in and of itself, you've done a self-assessment.
Let's see. One more. Some questions are coming in, Tom. How do we document procedure updates as a self-assessment?
By documenting it as a self-assessment. Well, that's kind of up to you, really. I can't think of a way to document as long as it is documented.
Yeah, certainly you should maintain revision control over that procedure, annotating the items that have been updated. For example, the FAR is updated frequently, not so much frequently lately, but in earlier days, and there's revision control, because contractors have to follow that as of the date of the contract, but I would maintain revision control. I might go one step further here. If I'm doing a procedure review, how did I address that as a self-assessment? Now, again, Tom has mentioned the issue of maturity. If your system is mature, then you might want to use mature or more detailed assessments than just reading through your procedure. I would prefer to see some validation, depending upon the complexity of your system, that things are working. Remember, we started right off front with the small contractor with one item of tooling looking over his or her shoulder at it, right? Do I think that that's an appropriate methodology for the big guys who are out there? No. Pragmatically, I think more depth and detail is required because of that complexity and potentially the greater risk. So it's not just a matter of maybe reading through the procedure and say, hey, we're done. I would want to see some validation that you looked at the application of that procedure out on the floor, in the factory, in the facility, wherever you're performing the work.
There's some questions here I can start, Doug, and you can weigh in. There's one, compliance to internal procedures doesn't assure compliance to the FAR requirement. Well, okay. As an ISO auditor recently drawn into property management audits, how do we ensure that the procedure captures all of the FAR requirements? You know, my answer to that is the expectation is that the contractor, upon award, has all the experience necessary knowledge and skills and abilities, if you will, to come to those conclusions, to write a procedure that captures all of the FAR requirements. So if you're asking, how do we ensure the procedure captures all of that, and you're unsure of how to do that, someone might question, well, why did we give you the contract if you don't know how to do that? Not to be pejorative, but the expectation is the government expects you to be able to do that. We can't, no one can tell you how to write a procedure. No one can tell you what the procedure should say, but surely in most cases, contractors have other procedures. For example, do you have a purchasing procedure? How do we know that your purchasing procedure captures all of the FAR requirements or all the DFAR requirements? It's the same kind of thing. Can't look for a guarantee here. Yes, the slides are available. There's another question here about, hold on, I just saw it. What would you recommend your records retention period for self-assessment? Record retention and all the contractor requirements are spelled out in, I believe, FAR Part 4.
4.7 specifically.
Yes. So that's my answer to that. Question about if the GP procedures are developed, why does DCMA have to approve them? DCMA doesn't approve procedures. DCMA evaluates procedures and comes up to a conclusion, a determination, which the contracting officer will make, either approve or disapprove the system, but they are not approvers. I don't know if they're on the line, but they are at best they are reviewers, so they don't approve procedures. Back in the day, they used to, but they no longer really have any authority to approve a procedure. Which is way different. Approving a procedure is way different than the contracting officer approving a system, which is a result of a PMSA, two different things. If the contractor has a property department of one person, can that person perform the review, assessment, audit? Well, I'd have to be there to answer that, but probably if the contractor is so small, only a couple of people, accommodations have to be made for things like that. How long do you keep your self-assessment for? Again, that's a records retention issue. Does an assessment need to be done at every site? You have 6 different sites. I would say you tell me. But maybe,
how did
maybe
you
so.
define your population for that process
Yes.
being done? And is that performance driven vis-a-vis
Yes.
record driven? If I have 6 different receiving areas, from a population definition standpoint, yeah, I could lump them together, but then if I find receiving inadequate or all 6 areas, you wouldn't be able to parse or to frame which area was causing a problem in receiving if you have 6 different receiving sites. So I got to go back to my answer that I use frequently. Hey, it depends. Let me see your procedures and what are we dealing with? If there are multiple receiving locations, then you might want to parse that more finely to see where there is a specific problem. So rather interesting question there.
Yeah, there's another question. If a review and update of procedures is considered a self-assessment, theoretically, there won't be any findings. Sure, there would be. There'd be any number of findings as you do your procedure development. So should DCMA be notified of self-assessment completion? There's a requirement to notify, but certainly you can, but I would not say that there shouldn't be any findings. You may find any number of findings in putting together your procedure.
Why did you update your procedures if there were no findings? You updated your procedures probably because you had findings, all right?
Yes.
So that's a good one there, right?
When performing a maintenance self-assessment, can you combine calibration, weapons maintenance into a total population, draw a sample from that? I'm going to give you that one, Doug.
Yeah, I don't know.
Next
Weapons
question.
maintenance is really, really specific. Are you dealing with the tech orders there, the mil specs for that maintenance, the tech manual on that maintenance? Calibration might be done externally, but weapons maintenance being done internally is driven by the tech orders. So again, I would have to see more specific detail in terms of combining calibration with weapons maintenance. No. I need more. I need more data in regard to my ability to answer that question.
There's this question here. What are your thoughts on the October release of DCMA's guidebook in relation to the, my thoughts are reflected in this presentation.
We have peers on both sides, government and industry. So you've received some of our understanding as to what's going on, maybe some concerns. So stuff that we want you to think about. And on that point, Tom, I have 2:07. We've gone over a few minutes, but some great questions. I would like to say on behalf of both Tom and myself, thank you.
Thank you.
We have our picture flip-flop there. Tom is on the right on the picture. I'm on the left. I had originally in the presentation put our baby pictures. Tom didn't think that was a good idea. All right, so a more recent shot of the two of us from one. I believe that was.
Well, I thought it was a good. I thought it was a good idea, but your daguerreotype just didn't come out well on the PowerPoint.
Hey, Matthew Brady took a really good shot, Tom. You know. So if you need to reach us, there are phone numbers, there are email address there. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you on behalf of Tom and myself. Kim, we're turning it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Doug and Tom, again for speaking today. Our next webinar is scheduled for Wednesday, March 24th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And Ms. Yvonne Batcher will be presenting Property 101, Essential Aspects and Keys to Success in a COVID Environment. You can still register for this webinar on our MPMA website under the Asset Management Awareness Fund page, or through the news flash. You can click through there as well. In addition to our webinar series, if you have not had a chance to complete our Asset Management Awareness Month crossword puzzle, there is still time. The contest runs until the end of the month and will include Amazon gift cards for 10 random lucky winners. And then there's also still time to order your MPMA exclusive face mask and donate to the foundation. Face masks are $15 plus shipping and handling, and are delivered directly to you. It'll be about mid-April when those would arrive. And then again, you can find all this information on our asset management page. I hope you enjoyed today's session. I sure did. Thank you again, Doug and Tom, and have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Goodbye.
Bye.